Hey guys, this is Jerry Brewer of East Bay Hitting Instruction. Thanks for tuning in today. We're going to talk about coil and the swing, specifically lower body coil, kind of this mysterious thing. What is it? What's going on? So just some basics. What is coil? Well, for this talk, let's just think of the analogy of a spring. All right. And so a spring, what's good about it is you can put it in tension and then you can get more power out of it. And so that's a very good thing. Really, something very important we're going to try to keep in mind is that a spring only works if one side is stationary. Okay, if you pull on a spring or you twist it towards a spring, you only create tension, you only create power if one side's not moving. Okay, if the other side's moving, you just have turn. All right, so that's going to be, we're going to really try to focus on that. There's a difference between coil and turn, at least in terms of my terminology. So this is how we're going to proceed with that. Okay. We're going to look at this as basically a counter movement for increased power. Okay, if you want to get into the nuts and bolts of what's really happening, we're going to look at stretch shortening cycle of muscle tendon units. Okay, if you're more interested in that, there's a lot of good material on stretch shortening cycle. Look at Hooke's law. A lot of people kind of butcher this. When you use a stretch shortening cycle, you're really storing power in the tendon, not in the muscle. You don't really want to stretch muscle. So if you talk about this, make sure you get it right. Do a little bit of research on the stretch shortening cycle. We're kind of just acknowledge that's what's going on and then kind of look at this in the swing. Okay, so in terms of a counter movement, what is a counter movement? Think of a high jump. Our goal is to go up, but we go down before we go up. Okay, and so utilizing a counter movement allows you to generate power. And so I would argue maybe the more important thing is that it allows you to generate power in less time. One thing Kyle Bodie mentioned in his pitching book is that elite pitchers, they don't necessarily generate more rotational power, they generate it more quickly. Their acceleration is faster. So I would say this is part of it. This is a really important thing. We want to be able to generate power, but we want to generate it really quickly, and we can help with that if we use a counter movement. Okay, so you can see by the utilization of a counter movement, we're able to get a higher peak power and also in less time, as opposed to just a static concentric action. Okay. So what is a counter movement? It consists of three phases. Basically, your loading phase, your going down, your transition phase, your amortization phase, and then finally your execution, your jumping in the air. Okay. And what is really important to keep in mind is this transition period is very, very crucial. Okay. You want to keep that period as very, very small as possible. Okay. You want to load quickly and you want to get out of it quickly. All right. Because the benefit decays exponentially with time. There's been studies to show with the counter movement jump and also the bench press, if your delay between loading and executing is around 400 to 500 milliseconds, you're basically starting from a dead stop. Okay, if you load and just hang out there forever, it's doing you no good. You just don't get any benefit of doing the counter movement. Okay. So in terms of lower body coil in the swing, it's very complex. It's a three-dimensional problem. We're really going to encourage to focus on that. We look at the side a lot. I'm going to show some things from the front that are very, very important. Okay, particularly with the lower body, there's different types of coil. There's the hips. Basically your leg bone attaching inside your hips. That joint. There's also the pelvis, the lumbopelvic joint. And so there's lots of different types of coil. I'm going to call hip coil, inner pelvis coil. I'm going to call pelvis coil. All right. So there's kind of the whole unit moving as a function. So today I'm going to talk about the pelvis as a unit working. Okay, I'm going to skip the kind of intracoil for a later date because I don't want this thing to blow up and we only have so much time today. Okay. All right, so just to be aware, there's a lot of muscles, a lot of tension happening right here. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of different angles, a lot of different ways to use these muscles. So it's a benefit. We have a lot of opportunity in this lower body, in our pelvic region to generate power. We have a lot of opportunity to also go wrong. Okay, so just with that, that's kind of our basics. Let's look at some clips, right? All right, let's fire up Jose Bautista. Okay, so here's Jose Bautista from the side. And this is a home run on about as hard as a ball you'll ever see hit. Okay, so he's going to come up and in his stride, and he's going to lift his leg up right here. All right, so what's happening here? All right, his left leg is coiling. Okay, so I would call this hip coil. He is internally rotating this left hip, and that's getting him some hip coil. I would argue his pelvis is not really coiling at this point. Okay, and here's what I mean by that. Let's watch his shoulder and his left hip. All right, his lead shoulder and his lead hip. Okay, they're both kind of working together there. Okay, that's not really coil. There's internal coil in the hip socket, yes, but again, his whole body is turning here. Remember, to have coil, to have tension, one thing must be stationary. Okay, so there's not really anything stationary when looking at the pelvic to the lumbar spine. This whole thing is kind of turning here. There's not really any tension here. All right. So where's he going to get tension? All right. Well, we're going to see the lead shoulder is going to kind of quit turning. We're going to get to this point. All right. So has the pelvis moved anymore? Yes, a little bit. The left hip has kind of reached its maximum internal rotation. But look at the angle between the right leg and the hip. Now, not a lot going on. There's some internal rotation there, but not a lot. Okay. So let's watch what happens here. As he moves out, there we go. Okay. See the angle between this. The rear leg here, I can draw this angle where it went from just being straight, just being here and here. Oop, stop, and now we got here. Okay, so what we see here is he's really turned this entire pelvis. Okay, he's rotated his entire pelvis without rotating his shoulders that much. There's some, a little bit, but again, to have a spring effect, to have coil, one side has to be stationary. So he's trying to hold his core as strong as possible here while turning his pelvis. Okay. That's where the tension is going to come up. That's where we're going to get some stretch shortening cycle out of the MTUs. That's the only way. One side has to be stationary. So his anterior core right here is very, very strong. He's holding this position and fighting the urge to turn completely back towards the catcher. Okay, his lower body is trying to turn him towards the catcher, but he's fighting that with his upper body. It's very, very important. That's coil. Okay, I'm arguing this right here is hip coil. This right here is pelvis coil. All right, they're different things. They're related, but they're different things. Okay, now he has some stored energy. Okay, so let's start a timer. We saw we have to get out of this pretty quickly. So he's reached, pretty much his maximum pelvis rotation right here. He doesn't have long to get out of it, and I would say right here he's going to start opening up. So he's gotten into his coil and out of his coil in about 200 milliseconds. So he's getting out of it pretty fast. He got into it quickly and he's getting out of it quickly, and that's very, very important. Okay, so now right here, he's going back through neutral. But he's going back through neutral with some speed. And so now as he opens up, he's going to have more power, just like we saw in that chart. He did a counter movement here, and as he starts his movement, he's going to have more power. And if you really want to think about it, he's doing a stretch here, going through neutral, and then creating a stretch there. So he's getting two, basically, counter movements out of one. But if he allowed this whole thing to sag, if there wasn't a strong connection here between his lumbar spine and his anterior core, this whole thing would turn, and there would be no stretch right here. It would just be a turn. All right? So that's very, very important. Okay? So also, like I said, this is a three-dimensional problem. Let's look at it from the front. Something very, very important is happening from the front. Okay, here's what we see. He's going to turn his shoulders in, and that's all the shoulder turn he's going to get. So as he's rotating his pelvis forward, he's not allowing the thoracic spine to really go with it. He's creating tension. Okay, so watch his left hip, his lead hip, how he's going to sit down right there. Okay, that is incredibly important. I would consider that coil as well. Again, it's not from the side, it's from the frontal view. But what he's doing here is really kind of rotating his pelvis under. Okay, that's creating another stretch. That's creating another counter movement for him to get out of. Okay, this is a little bit of posterior pelvic tilt. Okay, basically he's trying to turn his crotch up. Okay, he's not letting his crotch dump down towards the ground. He's turning it up, and what that's going to do is set up his hip extension right there. Very, very powerful movement. Okay, if he didn't counter rotate right here with the hips a little bit, he would not have as much hip extension available. The hip extension would already be kind of used up. What that does is when we set that hip down, that really stiffens up that lower back and recruits that interior core, and now we're going to have a good transmission path to drive this hip extension through the back.